Hello, everyone, and welcome into another edition of The Deadline. As we're quickly coming down to the very end of the 2023 high school football season. This week, a little bit of a light week as most of our teams were on bye this week. You had Broome off this week, Spartanburg was off this week, Union County was off this week, and Greer was off this week. So just a total of 6 games this week on the schedule, so a little bit light. Something else was a little bit light, just an annoying light rain through most of our games this week. That was a bit of a pest, caused some problems out there this week, as you might can guess. But it was still a pretty good week, all in all. Had some pretty good games out there this week. A couple of big ones, particularly on the 5A level. Let's talk about that for a minute. First of all, we had the Burns Dorman game this week, the annual rivalry game between Burns and Dorman this year, played at Nixon Field. I was in attendance for this one. Burns pulled off a 28-26 win in this one, but don't let that fool you. It was definitely not a very pretty game on either side of the ball for either team. And both defenses played absolutely stellar for most of the game. Offensively, it just was not very pretty. Um, let's jump into that one a little bit. Tell you what happened here. So Dorman started off the game in pretty explosive fashion on the defensive side of the ball. Burns quarterback Andrew Stevens, first play of the game, throws a pick six to Owen Hendricks, who was kind of waiting in the wings there. To be honest, I don't know what happened on this play. I don't know if there was a miscommunication with the route because he basically just kind of threw it right to Hendricks, and Hendricks was waiting on him right there where he threw it and took off for an easy 36-yard pick six. So I don't know if it was just a miscommunication on the route and receiver went on downfield or what, but either way, it was not an ideal start for Burns. And that was the first of 3 interceptions that Andrew Stevens threw in this game. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. But that set the tone very early on as Dorman jumped out to the 7-0 lead. Burns did manage to answer very nicely. They started an 80-yard drive, ended up marching down the field, capped on a 10-yard catch and run by Shamarius Bomar. One of the more impressive moves I've ever seen. Yeah, Shamarius Bomar is an athletic guy. He's got a little bit of size and speed to him. Kind of threw the ball out to him in the flat by the sticks, and he just kind of powered his way forward. He had one defender standing between him and the end zone, and to say he trucked him would be an understatement. He just absolutely bowled his way over him, powered his way in for the touchdown there, tied the game at 7. A little while later, Dorman retook the lead, and this was kind of painful for Burns because Burns was driving here. It looked like they were about to take the lead. They were inside the Dorman 10-yard line, and Andrew Stevens once again throws a pick six. It's Kentavian Anderson steps in front of a throw towards the sideline, picks it off literally right on the goal line, and then goes 100 yards untouched for a pick six. That gives Dorman the 14-7 lead, but fret not because special teams. Shout out to Alex Smith, Dorman radio broadcasters, big on special teams, so had to throw that out there. Shout out to you, Alex. Shamarius Bomar making plays again for Burns. He takes the ensuing kickoff back 97 yards, ties it up at 14, and that's where we went into the half, tied at 14. So a game where special teams and defense accounted for most of the offense there in the first half. In total, Dorman offensively in the first half only had 56 yards of total offense, but they had 136 yards of interception return yardage. That's insane. But the Dorman has been struggling on offense all season long. Yeah, Bryce O'Neill, they're still sticking with him out there at quarterback, and it looks like they're going to kind of ride things out with him. Bryce actually played a decent game in this, and we'll go a little bit more into some of the things he did there in the second half. Matter of fact, let's jump right into that. Burns and Dorman both kind of squandered chances here in the third and early on in the fourth quarter to try to take the lead. Burns got a big interception out of Josh Lee, set them up in plus territory on the Dorman side of the 50. Ultimately, though, in this series, for whatever reason, play calling got a little bit conservative. They ran the ball 4 straight times. I was told maybe Andrew Stevens was being checked on the sideline. I have no confirmation on that or whether or not he was hurt. I know Stevens did come back into the game, but on this particular series, they ran the ball 4 straight times and kind of didn't get anywhere. And the second two plays, or the second set of plays there, the third and fourth down plays, they went out of the Wildcat, ran a direct snap to Shamarius Bomar, and he got stopped basically at the line of scrimmage both times. So Burns ends up turning it over on downs there. That didn't end up coming back to haunt them as Dorman went 3 and out of their next series. But then Dorman comes up with their third interception of the game off of Andrew Stevens, which did end up prompting a quarterback change later on as they brought in Zy Landrum. We'll touch on that here in just a second. But Dorman comes up with their third pick off of Stevens. Demetric Foster hauls it in, sets Dorman up at their own 42-yard line. They drive it all the way down to the Burns 24, but here's where the game almost completely swung here. Questionable decision. I know at the time it's raining cats and dogs, the field is wet, the ball is wet, conditions are just not ideal for kicking a field goal. I get that, especially when it's going to be a 41-yard attempt here. And Dorman decides to fake it. And this is the second time I've seen them do this year. They did it against Boiling Springs on what would have been a chip shot, and it was direct snap to the kicker. He got stopped short there. In this situation, same thing happened. It was a direct snap back to Mitch Powell, the kicker. He goes to his left. Burns has the receiver that he was intended to throw to covered downfield, so Powell is forced to run for it. He gets stopped at the sticks, 10 yards short of the first down, so they turn it over on downs there. And that completely swung the game as Burns ended up scoring on their next series. They put in Zy Landrum back at quarterback, and Burns went on to score the next 14 unanswered. Zy Landrum marched him down the field 74 yards. He scores in a 38-yard scamper that gave them the lead 21-14 at the time. And then on the ensuing kickoff, monstrous hit. I'm not sure who laid it, but they laid a monster hit. Again, it was raining cats and dogs this time, so the ball's wet. Conditions were ideal to where he could force a turnover pretty easily, and they did. He lays a monster hit, jars the ball loose. Burns ends up recovering it at the 28-yard line of Dorman. And then the very next play, they hand it off to Trey Segura up the middle. The talented freshman running back breaks loose, ends up putting Burns up 2 scores on a 28-yard touchdown run. And credit to Dorman, they did manage to rally back. They put together one of their best drives of the season as Bryce O'Neill and company marched 66 yards on their next series, capped it off with a 27-yard touchdown strike from O'Neill to his favorite receiver now, KD Hainsworth. Unfortunately, botch snap on the PAT, so the deficit was left at 8 at this point, 28-20. Dorman kicks an onside kick. They recover it. They pull back within a score on the very next play as once again O'Neill hits KD Hainsworth and catches it and runs 52 yards for a touchdown. Pulls them within 2, but Burns, their defense, comes up with the big stops. They stop the 2-point conversion short and forced Dorman to have to kick another onside kick, and unfortunately it did not go Dorman's way. And Burns holds on for the 28-26 win in this game. A big win for Burns as they remain undefeated in region play, and again sets up a battle with Gaffney here in a couple of weeks with the region title on the line. But let's go back to an obvious point here. Andrew Stevens didn't have a good day. Threw 3 interceptions. Obviously not a good day. I hear the bad day thing. Everybody's allowed to have a bad day once in a while. That's great. But this is now back to back weeks where I have watched Andrew Stevens and have come away with the same take on him. Andrew Stevens is just not a passing threat. He's not a deep ball guy. Most of the time, he's got an arm on him, don't get me wrong, but he overthrows his man almost every time when he goes to take a deep shot down the field by at least 5 yards. And, obviously he has a problem with throwing interceptions in key moments. That's what costed them in the game against Chapman when Chapman beat them earlier this season. That's what costed them and very nearly ended up losing the game against Dorman here for them. And so, think about Andrew Stevens, and I've talked with Ryan Clary, the voice of the Spartanburg Vikings, and I've talked with Trey Stewart, who's a writer for the Greer Citizen. And Trey mostly covers Burns for the Greer Citizen. He sees him a lot, and he said same thing, that Stevens just isn't a deep ball threat. He doesn't throw the ball down the field. It's a guy that basically makes their offense to where they have to get the ball to their playmakers in space. And that's been Burns' MO over at least the last 3 weeks. I don't know about the rest of the season, but on offense, they just haven't been very creative. They've been just throwing the ball out in space, out into the flat, throwing the ball at the sticks, and just getting it out to Shamarius Bomar and their playmakers and just making them make plays in space. That's been their offense. And credit to them, it's worked. Obviously, they're undefeated in region play, and they're playing for a region championship. It's done enough for them. And a lot of credit also has to go to their defense on that. They've got a very elite defense. I could almost be said of every team in Region 2-5A. Every single one of the defenses of Region 2-5A is just absolutely amazing. But yeah, with Burns, they've rode that defense and doing just enough on the offensive side of the ball to where they're going to be playing for a region championship. So credit to them, it's worked. And credit to Reggie Shaw. Maybe, just maybe, that's the way they've had to script their offense this season. Maybe when that's all you've got, and that's your best guy, if Stevens is your best guy, then you've got to accommodate your offense for what he can do. And so maybe that's what they've had to do. They just had to make it to where all they do is just get the ball out in space to Bomar and put it in the hands of their playmakers. But the reality on that is Yeah, you've had Zylandrum back there. Zylandrum played for Boiling Springs a year ago. At Boiling Springs, he was a quarterback, lost his job to Lincoln Husky, who's turned out to be arguably the best quarterback in Region 2 5A, not named Riley Staten. And he lost a job there, got moved to wide receiver, so ended up transferring to Burns, got made a quarterback again at Burns, but he's been used as Stevens' backup up until this point, where he finally got a shot late in the game after Stevens threw 3 interceptions on Friday night. And so, yeah, the question that has to be begged from this, there's not necessarily a quarterback controversy here in Burns. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to try to create that. But yeah, obviously, with the limited sample time that he had, he didn't take the starting job from Andrew Stevens. It's probably still his job to lose at this point. But I can't help but think with the region on the line, eh, Burns is going to have to be more creative when they play Gaffney. There's no is, ands, or buts about it. With the region championship on the line, home field advantage throughout the playoffs on the line, you've got to be able to open up your playbook more because Gaffney's defense is going to do what they can to limit Shamarius Bomar. You're not going to be able to get the ball to him and him make big plays in space that much. Your defense might can create some turnovers. Your defense is certainly going to keep you in the games, but it just is the question is, it might be a little bit worthwhile to maybe give Zylander a few reps. I mean, you've got a bye week this week. You've got some time to implement some things. But yeah, I'm not saying that they need to use both quarterbacks interchangeably depending on the situation because that's never going to work. That's not going to open up your offense more. Yeah, you think about, yeah, you talk about using Shamarius Bomar out of the Wildcat and how Dorman snuffed that out. That's because they know what's going to happen. It's going to be a direct snap. He's going to run the ball. With Zylander being apparently more of a running quarterback from what I've seen, it's going to be obvious if they trot him out there that it's probably going to be a designed run of some sort or they're going to hand the ball off. So it's going to be easy for Gaffney's defense to snuff that out. But I think it may be worthwhile to test his arm, see what he can do, and maybe just give both of them some reps out there to keep Gaffney on their heels. Yeah, what can you lose at this point? If you don't win against Gaffney and win the region, it's not the end of the world. You're still going to be second in the region. You're still going to have a couple of home playoff games. So there's really nothing to lose on this. But if you're Burns, if you really want to win the region and have the best shot, it may be worth seeing if you can use Zylandrum in some capacity to open up your playbook because, frankly, from what I've seen the last couple of weeks, it's not going to cut it against Gaffney's defense. None of this is a knock on Andrew Stevens. None of this is a knock on Reggie Shaw or Burns or any of that. Like I said, maybe this is what they've realized to be their only choice in using Stevens. And if so, all right, roll with it. But just something to ponder going forward here. So again, Burns gets a 28-26 win over Dorman and will take on Gaffney for the Region 2 5A title here in a couple of weeks. They have a bye week next week. Elsewhere on the 5A ranks, we'll talk about Gaffney here for a second. They beat Boiling Springs 17-7. Boiling Springs now 0-4 over the last 4 games they played since getting off to that nice little stretch. They won a couple of games in a row there. But in this one, well, do you like defense? If so, this was the game for you because it took until the 6-minute mark of the first quarter for either team to crack the scoreboard. And those points actually ended up coming on defense. Boiling Springs forced a Gaffney fumble that was inside their own 5-yard line. Boiling Springs recovered it at their own 1. So the very next play, the Indians came up with a tackle in the end zone for a safety. They go up 2-0. About 3 minutes later, Gaffney adds on. Riley Staten connects with Jaden McDowell for a 20-yard touchdown, made it 9-0, and that ended up being the score at the half. Now, here's where it gets a little bit wonky. Gaffney, credit to them, that did their thing. They pulled away and won this game. They did just enough on the offensive side of the ball to do it. And Boiling Springs is no slouch on defense. Once again, every single defense in Region 2 5A, it can be said that these guys are all, I won't say elite in Boiling Springs' case, because obviously they've still got some room for growth, but Boiling Springs still has a very solid defense, and by and large, that's the strength of their team outside of Lincoln Husky. But Boiling Springs had a couple of huge chances to break that goose egg, and it didn't go their way. Right before the half, they had a pass where Husky connected with Kyle Patterson over the middle in the back of the end zone, and the refs ruled that he was out of bounds, called it incomplete. Second instance, Boiling Springs is all the way inside the Gaffney 10-yard line. This is late in the third quarter. Gaffney's King Dowdle comes up with a big interception. Actually, this is in the fourth quarter, excuse me. King Dowdle comes up with a big interception there to keep the Bulldogs out of the end zone in this one. And then, well, It was all Jaden McDowell from there. Jaden McDowell scored his second touchdown of the game later on a 1 yard rush, made it 17-0. Bowling Springs finally scored with about 3 minutes to play in the game, and Lincoln Husky took it in from 5 yards out. But otherwise, story of this game is obviously Gaffney's defense did their thing, and Riley Staten did just enough. On the Gaffney end, Riley Staten was 14 for 24, 158 yards. Jade McDowell had 139 yards on 20 carries with 2 touchdowns. And on Bowling Springs' side, Lincoln Husky 19 for 29, 154 yards, 42 yards on the ground with a touchdown. Eli Mobley was back this week for Boiling Springs. He was injured last week against Burns, didn't play, but he was back in action this week and led Boiling Springs. Had 52 yards on 3 catches. Tristan Horsey Johnson had 43 yards on 4 receptions. And on the defensive side of the ball, Cohen Sloan and Christian Thompson each had 9 tackles, while Cohen Sloan had an interception. So a big night on defense for Boiling Springs, but ultimately not enough. Their offense unable to produce, which has been the story of the season for the Bulldogs. There's just not enough around Lincoln Husky for them. They got Javen Chim, but when Javen Chim isn't going and they're not able to establish a run game, it just never bodes well for Boiling Springs. You saw it play out against Dorman. Now you've seen it play out against Gaffney. Good news for Boiling Springs is you do have a winnable game next week. You take on Spartanburg. Spartanburg still what the question mark going forward here for Spartanburg is whether or not TJ Johnson will play. If TJ Johnson doesn't play, there's a solid chance Bowling Springs wins this game. But I'm looking at this one and thinking that either way, just because Bowling Springs' offense has been so up and down this season, because Spartanburg has arguably one of the best defenses in the state, it's going to be a low scoring affair. Bowling Springs, if TJ Johnson doesn't play, and Bowling Springs can avoid the turnover bug and come up with a couple of big plays on the ground, Bowling Springs can win this one in a close one, but it could also go the other way. So this is going to be an interesting game to watch next week because it's basically for fourth place in the region, possibly. Because I don't think Spartanburg Dorman game is going to be an interesting one to circle at the end of the season. But again, that's going to hinge very heavily on whether or not T.J. Johnson is going to play. And what Dorman has shown over the last couple of weeks that they can hang with anybody, especially with that defense. It's just a question mark. It's going to be their offense. You look for this one that's a couple of weeks. It's probably going to be a low scoring affair too. So this could either be for fourth place in the region or it could be to ensure that you get the at-large bid. That's the way you have to look at this Bowling Springs Spartanburg game this week. And it's definitely going to be probably an exciting one to watch. Not necessarily exciting in the terms of having offensive fireworks, but with so much on the line and because the Bowling Springs Spartanburg game is always such a nice natural rivalry, yeah, I look for it to be pretty good next week. But Gaffney will take on Dorman next week, and the key for Gaffney here is not to be looking ahead to the region championship. I don't think Dan Jones is going to let that happen. He's not going to let Gaffney just kind of overlook Dorman and see them as an easy win because Dorman, once again, they have proven they can hang with anybody. They can possibly come out here and pull an upset. So it's not necessarily going to be easy for Gaffney, and the key for them is just going to be to take care of business next week and look ahead to that region championship showdown with Burns here in a couple of weeks. Should Dorman pull the upset in this one, it does throw a huge wrench into things. Region 2-5A is going to probably end up having a tiebreaker somewhere along the line, and I don't know who came up with the tiebreaker in this, but it's the point differential at the end of the third quarter, head to head, and that just doesn't make any sense. It never has, never will, and it creates the most insane scenarios to try to do the math to figure out. But yeah, at some point or another, expect that there's probably going to be a tiebreaker here in Region 2-5A one way or another. Either way, the region is still wide open. There's not necessarily a clear-cut winner, and that's one thing that makes Region 2-5A so great. Elsewhere last night, Chapman continued to take care of business. Again, basically, said it all season long. Circle the Chapman Broom game. That's for the region championship later on down the road. And Chapman jumped ahead on the fourth play of the game. Matthias Scott broke up the gut for an 84-yard touchdown run against Travelers Rest, a team that obviously Chapman was going to beat handily. And Matthias Scott had 9 carries for 148 yards and 3 touchdowns in this one, and they absolutely rolled to a 56-0 shutout win over TR. Coleman Gray in this one, solid as usual passing. He went 11 for 18 with 173 yards and a pair of touchdowns. Also ran the ball 6 times for 59 yards, and then Bennett Smith led the way receiving. He had 2 catches with a touchdown. Woodruff continues to have kind of a tough go of things. They had a tough matchup in this one. Granted, they hosted Clinton. They fell 36-20, but the signs of improvement are still there for Woodruff. That maybe Woodruff will get back to the level that we're used to seeing out of them here within the next couple of years. And then Chesney continues to absolutely roll. Chesney's been a pleasant surprise this season. They've started slinging the ball around more instead of trying to be more of an option offense, and it's worked for them ever since, especially since region play started. They beat Blacksburg 54-13. They had that tough loss last week on the road to Abbeville, where that was the second game they played in a 5-day span. They beat Landrum 40-21 on the Monday before, but Chesney went and they scored the first 21 points of the game unanswered. Blacksburg finally broke through. They traded scores, ended up going into the half up 27-13, but then Chesney came out in the second half and absolutely blew them away, scored 28 unanswered. KJ Proctor, 7-10 passing for 126 yards and a pair of touchdowns. He also had 10 rushes for 25 yards of the touchdown. Austin Bigford led the way on the ground. He had 111 yards on 14 attempts of the touchdown. Adonis Burgess had a pair of touchdowns, 73 rushing yards. And then Jaden Williams had a pair of rushing touchdowns. So just an absolute, they ran the ball a lot, but they also had a lot of passing stats there. Caleb Blanton hauled in 4 receptions for 108 yards with a pair of touchdowns. So just an all-around great offensive showing for Chesney against a Blacksburg team that, though, is resurgent and is looking like they're trending in the right direction since Josh Batchelor took over as their head coach in place of Jet Turner. They've still got, obviously, quite a ways to go. Meanwhile, Chesney's had the talent in place, and now it looks like Chesney's finally utilizing it in the way they should, and it's paying off in dividends for them. So Chesney's going to hit the road next week. They'll take on 96. That's going to be a tough one for them there, but still a solid chance that Chesney can come out second place in this region. In the meanwhile, Landrum, their rough go of things continued. Obviously, Landrum was not going to win this week, so they're taking on Abbeville. But this is the first time this season that Landrum has been shut out. So Abbeville beat them 56-0. So Colton Link wasn't even able to put up any points for them this week against Abbeville. Abbeville's defense just absolutely stymied them from the get-go. And now, interestingly enough, we talked about Landrum a couple of weeks ago, how they looked like they could easily be second place in the region again. And now they may not even make the playoffs. I know the injury bug has kind of hit them kind of hard over the last couple of weeks. They got some guys that are banged up. It's not helping them. But now their hopes of making the playoffs are either over the next 2 weeks they're going to have to beat either Liberty or Blacksburg, and both of those are going to be tough tests for them. And so let's see if Landrum can pull out one of those and still squeak their way into the playoffs. You would hate for such a season that started off so well for them to end up turning that far south, but nonetheless, even if they don't make the playoffs, I wouldn't necessarily say this is a bad first year for Coach Bridges out there. But that pretty much does it for this week in high school football. We'll look ahead to next week. We're going to have some more teams on bye, but a few more games next week nonetheless, and it should be an interesting one. Again, you got Bowling Springs Spartanburg next week, Gaffney Dorman, which Gaffney should win that one, but you never know. Dorman, again, has proven they can hang with just about anybody. Should be an interesting week next week in high school football. That'll do it for week 8. We'll see you next week.